If you've been paying attention to things lately, you might have noticed a pattern that is evolving. We watch speeches by the president where he veers off topic, rambles on tangents, brings up old slights, real and imagined, that have nothing to do with the topic of the day, only to be told by Caroline Leavitt that the speech was brilliant, historic, and without any problems or missteps at all. We hear math-defying statements about drug prices dropping 300, 500, 1,000%, knowing all the while that that is not possible, only to hear them repeated over and over again as if gospel. We watch videos of ICE agents killing citizens, only to be told by the likes of Kristi Noem and J.D. Vance and Trump himself that what we saw with our own eyes is not to be believed. There has been a premium placed on denying reality, about ignoring logic and suspending disbelief of any kind where the current administration is concerned. This insistence on forgetting common sense is no more apparent than where the Epstein files are concerned. We've been waiting for what seems like an eternity for the totality of the files to finally be released, for the frosted windows between the public and the truth to be opened. Now, when the documents actually arrive, you realize the windows are technically open, but someone has filled the room with smoke. This is one of those moments. Millions of pages, years of waiting, endless rhetoric about releasing everything. And yet, somehow, the biggest questions remain exactly where they were before, in the dark. From minimalization to ignorance to outright denials, we are once again being told that 2 + 2 is not 4, that up is really down, and that, much like what Oz insisted to Dorothy and her crew, there's nothing to see behind the curtain. Hello, everyone. You're listening to Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast where we talk about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today we're going to be talking about the recent release of what the Department of Justice called the rest of the Epstein files. A moment that was supposed to be a historic act of transparency, accountability, and closure. Instead, what we got feels more like a carefully curated information dump, wrapped in legal caution tape and political spin and a whole lot of plausible deniability. If you've been following the story even casually, you know that the Epstein saga has been a slow-motion nightmare for American institutions. A billionaire financier who moved in elite circles, allegations of trafficking, powerful acquaintances, a mysterious death in jail, and years of legal battles over sealed records. The public was told again and again that someday we would see everything. That day supposedly just arrived, but what everything actually means depends a lot on who you ask. I want to talk about what was released, what was new, and what was conspicuously vague. How senior officials have talked about it, and why, especially in the light of everything we already know about Donald Trump's history, it strains credulity to accept the idea that no one but Jeffrey Epstein himself is the criminal. So I'll get to that shortly, but first, let's go over some hot topics. With all the other things going on in the country and the world these days, you'd think that beautification projects would be low on the president's list of priorities. But of course, the idea of presidential priorities these days is a world different than anything we might have come to expect. I want to talk a little bit about all the construction currently happening or being planned in Washington, D.C. So first of all, we have the White House ballroom. President Trump's vision for a new White House ballroom has evolved significantly since its inception. It was initially estimated that it was going to cost $200 million. The project has ballooned to $400 million. The 90,000 square foot addition, designed to host up to 1,350 guests, replaces the historic East Wing, which housed the offices of every First Lady since Eleanor Roosevelt. While the administration claims the project will be funded through private donations, concerns have arisen about potential taxpayer contributions. The demolition of the East Wing proceeded before the completion of required federal reviews, which, that fits, that tracks with what we know about this administration. And it's led to legal challenges from preservationists. Then we have the Arc de Trump. And in a move that reminds you of historical autocrats, President Trump has proposed a 250-foot tall triumphal arch in Washington, D.C., estimated to cost $100 million. Modeled after Paris's Arc de Triomphe, this Arc de Trump is intended to commemorate the nation's 250th anniversary. Right. The president has expressed a preference for the largest and most opulent design, featuring gold and white finishes. Again, no surprise there. Funding for this arch is expected to come from private donors, again, with sparse little information about who the donors are. But reports are indicating that Trump has raised $1.9 billion for various construction projects and political activities. So just let's put all that together. $100 million arch, and he's raised just shy of $2 billion. Nothing to see here. And then, of course, there's the most recent news that came out just this week that the Trump Kennedy Center is going to be renovated. The formerly known Kennedy Center, a symbol of American arts and culture, is set to, according to a Truth Social post from the Commander-in-Chief, undergo a sweeping renovation under his directive. Announced on February 1st, the project will close the center for 2 years, starting on July 4th of 2026. So far, the cost of this renovation has not been disclosed, but the One Big Beautiful Act passed in 2025 allocated $257 million for the project. Now, I'll give credit where credit is due. At least, in this particular case, Congress got a say. But notably, the center has been informally rebranded the Donald J. Trump and John F. Kennedy Memorial Center for the Performing Arts. And of course, that in and of itself is a change that has stirred controversy and raised questions about the president's motives. So, these ambitious projects all come at a time when many Americans are facing lots of economic hardships. While the president touts a robust economy, the reality for many people is one of penny pinching and uncertainty. The allocation of substantial funds, public or private, to grandiose construction projects raises concerns about the administration's priorities, as if there weren't enough concerns about those already. Moreover, the focus on the self-aggrandizing monuments and facilities seem at odds with the pressing needs of the United States right now, such as, healthcare, education, infrastructure. The decision to invest in personal legacy projects rather than addressing systematic issues, it's going to have lasting implications for public trust and national unity, to say the least. President Trump's construction initiatives in Washington, D.C. reflect a desire to leave a lasting personal legacy. However, the timing and the scale, they leave a lot to be debated. Normally, when monuments bear a president's name, the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, so on, they're done after the president's term certainly has ended, and they're done in order to honor the president. The idea of a president creating his own monuments ahead of time is gaudy, to say the least, and unprecedented, certainly. As the nation approaches its 250th anniversary, the emphasis on monumental architecture over, actual policy may serve as a testament not to national pride, but to presidential vanity. I mean, we're talking about arguably the biggest ego in the history of the United States. And I think the real priority for all this construction is that it will leave lasting reminders of his time in office, ones that probably would never have come to pass if it was left to the normal circumstances. So speaking of money and what it's used for, we are in the throes of yet another government shutdown, albeit this time a partial shutdown. There has been, once again, gridlock in the houses of Congress to actually finalize a budget, and we are in what is now not a shutdown like the one we had in the fall, but a partial shutdown. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. So what's on the chopping block this time? Well, not everything, but enough to cause at least a collective national eye roll. The Departments of Defense, Labor, Health and Human Services, Transportation, and Housing and Urban Development are all feeling the pinch. Now, essential services like Social Security and Medicare continue. Many federal employees are either furloughed or working without pay. That sounds familiar. Agencies like the IRS, the FCC, the SEC, and even the National Park Service are operating in a limited capacity or not at all. And spring is always the best time to have the IRS at limited capacity. Imagine, on the lighter side of this, the less political side of it, imagine planning a family trip to a national park only to find the gates once again locked and the rangers on involuntary vacation. Or, perhaps more importantly, at this time of the year, needing assistance from the IRS in tax season, but getting a voicemail that says, "We're closed due to political gridlock." It's like the government hit the snooze button on its responsibilities. Of course, the elephant, or should I say, the ICE agent in the room, is the thing at the heart of this shutdown, and that's a heated debate over funding for immigration and customs enforcement. All these recent incidents that we've been living through in the first month of 2026, including the fatal shootings of 2 U.S. citizens by federal agents in Minneapolis, have intensified scrutiny on ICE's operations. Democrats are pushing for reforms. Body cameras for agents, and actually I just got a news alert today that they are going to issue body cams for ICE agents, which is good news. But also restrictions on warrantless home entries and an end to masked operations. That's the big one as far as I'm concerned. These are all things that the Democrats are pushing for, not nearly hard enough, if you ask me. Republicans, on the other hand, argue that these measures would hinder law enforcement and border security. Aside from that being nonsense, this all amounts to a classic standoff: reform versus enforcement, accountability versus authority. So, with this pissing match going on, and an important one, I don't want to downplay it, When can we expect this political theater to conclude? Well, there is a glimmer of hope. The Senate has passed a 5-bill funding package, excluding the contentious Department of Homeland Security funding, which includes ICE. A temporary 2-week extension for DHS funding has been proposed to buy time for further negotiations. However, the House isn't scheduled to reconvene until today, the day of this recording, Monday, which leaves the government in limbo. No news has come out yet that I'm aware of at this time as to the fate of that funding package. If both chambers can agree on the separate funding bills and the temporary DHS extension, we could be in for a shutdown and soon. But if the stalemate continues, we could be in for a prolonged period of political posturing and public frustration. We're all too familiar with that. One happened in the months before the holidays. While the politicians debate policy and funding, it's everyday Americans who bear the brunt of the shutdown. Federal employees face uncertainty about their paychecks. Small businesses awaiting government loans are left in the lurch. Travelers may experience delays due to reduced staffing at airports. It's like watching a group of chefs argue over the recipe while the kitchen is on fire. The longer the shutdown persists, the more damage is done, not just to government operations, but to the public trust in general. And while they're debating this spending bill, they're not working on other things that are terribly in need of attention. The shutdown isn't just about ICE funding. It's a symptom of, a deeper dysfunction in our political system. There is a total inability to find any common ground these days. The preference for grandstanding over governance is immense, and the willingness to use all these essential services as bargaining chips all point to a need for some systematic change. Perhaps it's time for our leaders to remember that their primary role is to serve us, not just the party's agenda. Until then, we, the citizens, have to stay informed and stay engaged and try to hold them accountable. We'll have a great opportunity to do so this fall. So apparently the unintended theme of this week's episode, at least the Hot Topics, is money. Because we have another money-related hot topic. And I think we could start this one on a concept that just about everyone agrees on. You don't want your tax dollars wasted, right? We can all agree on that. You'd rather get value for the folksy phrase, every buck counts, especially when those bucks are supposed to protect students from discrimination, harassment, and unequal treatment in schools. But what if I told you that the federal government spent tens of millions of dollars paying employees who sat at home doing exactly nothing, while thousands of complaints of discrimination piled up unanswered? That's not the setup for a joke or some new blockbuster movie. That is actually the conclusion of a recent GAO report examining the Trump administration's handling of staffing at the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or OCR. So I want to talk about exactly what happened and the human and legal drama that followed and the hard dollar cost, not philosophical cost, not poetic cost, but the actual taxpayer money of putting civil rights protections on pause. So let's start off with what is the Office of Civil Rights and why is it important? The OCR isn't some esoteric paper shuffler. It's the part of the U.S. Department of Education that is charged with enforcing federal laws that prohibit discrimination in schools and universities. That includes protections based on race, sex, national origin, disability, age, and more. Think of OCR as the hotline students and families call when they've been mistreated because they're black or because they're disabled or because a school turned a blind eye to harassment. Every year, thousands of complaints flow into OCR. These aren't trivial. We're talking about allegations of discrimination that can shape a child's future. For example, not getting necessary accommodations for a disability or enduring persistent racial bias on a campus. Ignoring or interrupting this work isn't just bureaucratic drama. This is an attack on fundamental protections that students and families rely on. In March of 2025, the Trump administration decided it was time for a more efficient OCR. Translation, a massive reduction in force that aimed to cut more than half of the OCR staff. That included civil rights attorneys, investigators, and support personnel, the very people who handle those discrimination complaints that I was describing to you. Secretary of Education Linda McMahon tried to frame it as mission-focused, a move towards efficiency and accountability. It sounds great in a press release until you realize that the way they pursued it was something very much different. Instead of letting staff do their jobs, the department froze them out of their offices and separated them from their workload. After the cuts were announced, courts stepped in, multiple lawsuits blocked the actual terminations, and forced the department to retain the affected employees. But here's the twist that smells more like a bureaucratic sitcom than serious personnel reform. Instead of returning these career professionals to work, the department kept them on paid administrative leave for 9 months. After all of the rhetoric about DOGE and eliminating government waste, when the courts ruled against the federal government arbitrarily laying all these people off or firing all these people, they complied with the court order in that they didn't fire them, but they still wouldn't let them work. From March through mid-December, while the legal battles played out, all these employees sat at home getting paid. In other words, the Trump administration couldn't fire the OCR lawyers and investigators, but they could sure as heck keep them from working, and taxpayers footed the bill. Now here's the part that makes you raise an eyebrow. The nonpartisan U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, took a hard look at what this mess cost and concluded that paying people to not work rang up a tab between $28.5 and $38 million. That covers salaries, benefits, and other compensation for the OCR employees on administrative leave. Paid administrative leave. Now, let's pause here and appreciate the absurdity. Hundreds of employees were literally paid to sit at home while the very office tasked with enforcing federal civil rights laws stood idle. And this was all done for the sake of efficiency. It's like paying firemen to watch a warehouse burn because you decided that the stuff in the warehouse cost too much money. GAO's figures came from analyzing court filings, payroll data, records from Department of Education itself. But, and this is a big but, GAO also noted that the department did not fully account for all the potential costs and savings associated with the firing or the laying off, despite federal guidance requiring them to provide that documentation. So the actual cost could be even more. We just don't know because the Department of Education didn't bother to track everything properly. That's the federal government's version of efficiency. So while OCR's talented professionals twiddled their thumbs in administrative limbo, discrimination complaints didn't just stop coming in. Between March and September of last year, OCR received more than 9,000 complaints of alleged discrimination. Again, race, disability, sex-based issues, you name it. And here's where things get ugly. Of the 7,072 complaints that OCR resolved in that period, roughly 90% of them were dismissed. That means the office collected complaints and then simply dropped them without investigation. Some dismissals aren't inherently bad if the case lacks grounds or jurisdiction, but the rate here is staggering. For context, during the Obama administration, typical dismissal rates were closer to half of all complaints, not 9 out of every 10. With investigations sidelined, students and families were left in that bureaucratic no man's land where nothing gets resolved and everything just gets postponed indefinitely. That's the legal version of your call is important to us, but then being put on eternal hold. Meanwhile, OCR hadn't even updated its public list of institutions under active investigation since January of 2025. Again, this is a transparency issue. We're told that this administration is all about transparency, but not updating that list is reducing transparency and leaving families with far less visibility into which schools were being held accountable for discrimination complaints. This isn't just theory. Unions representing federal workers, like AFGE Local 252, warned that this administrative paralysis could contribute to a massive backlog of unresolved cases. And they weren't wrong. As of late December, this past December, when some staff were finally called back to work, union leaders reported significant backlogs and argued the entire debacle had wasted more than $40 million. Yes, even higher than that GAO estimate. So why did all this happen? Partly because of court intervention, multiple suits were filed against the department's layoffs, and judges stepped in with injunctions that prevented the firings from fully going through. That forced OCR employees to stay on the books, even though they weren't permitted to do their actual jobs. Again, efficiency. In early January, this January 2026, the department rescinded the firing order for OCR staff and started bringing them back to their desks. The official rationale was that restoring workforce capacity would help tackle the mounting backlog of complaints. But, let's face it, this feels less like thoughtful planning and more like a last-minute panic move after the optics and the lawsuits and the GAO report made the administration look ridiculous. This whole episode fits into a broader context of the efforts by Education Secretary McMahon and the Trump administration as a whole to downsize or undermine parts of the education system, the Department of Education, including other layoffs and office closures that also sparked litigation and widespread concern. Now, at the end of the day, numbers like 28 million to 38 million to 40 million are impressive, but the true cost is best measured in the real lives affected. When an OCR investigator isn't showing up to work, a complaint about a student being denied disability accommodations goes unanswered. When civil rights attorneys are on leave, schools feel freer to delay or dismiss cases involving sexual harassment or racial discrimination. That's not hypothetical. It's documented by the surge in complaints and the drought in meaningful investigations. And in a country where education is supposed to be a right, theoretically, not a privilege, letting discrimination complaints languish erodes trust in the system and harms children who surely deserve better. So here's the takeaway. A nonpartisan watchdog found that political machinations led to hundreds of civil rights protectors being paid millions to do nothing, while the very people they're supposed to defend, students facing discrimination, were left waiting without resolution. That's not efficiency. It's certainly not accountability. It's not even cost-effective compliance with the federal law. It's bureaucratic dysfunction with a big price tag, and a real human cost as well, that's hard to justify no matter what your political stripe is. So yes, once again, the main topic for this episode is the Epstein files. We've talked about it numerous times before, and I don't think we're going to be done anytime soon. But for now, let's start with the basics of the recent developments. The Department of Justice's latest release was massive. Millions of pages of documents, emails, court filings, photos, exhibits, and other attachments connected to civil litigation involving Epstein and his associates. This wasn't a neat, organized report with a table of contents and footnotes. It was more like the digital equivalent of dumping a truckload of file boxes onto the ground and saying, have fun. That scale matters because sheer volume can create an illusion of transparency. When you release 3 million pages, you can technically say, hey, we released everything. Even if crucial material is redacted, scattered, missing, or just practically impossible for ordinary people to sift through. Now, almost immediately, journalists and researchers found that some of the released files had to be pulled back because they contained identifying information about victims, which, of course, is important to protect. But it also raises a bigger question. If this was so carefully prepared, if so much time was spent preparing this, and the delay after delay after delay, how did these omissions happen? How was this job botched? Or was the job even botched? Perhaps these omissions were a calculated one. Now, more importantly, buried inside this mountain of material were new references to prominent figures, including Donald Trump. And just to be totally clear here, these aren't proof. They're not definitive conclusions, but there are reports and allegations and references to many individuals that have reignited controversy rather than settling it. So right out of the gate, the big transparency moment looked less like Truth and Reconciliation and more like a chaotic document drop that is begging for follow-up that, according to two key sources, will not be coming. But I'll get to that in a moment. Now, one of the reasons this release got so much attention is because it contains material that hadn't been public before, including lots of references to President Trump. To be clear, these files did not suddenly produce a clean, court-adjudicated verdict about his or anyone's involvement with Epstein. What they did do was add more context to what we already knew, and in some cases, raise new questions. There were specific, as yet verified, let alone proven, allegations that mentioned Trump's name. There were reports compiled by the FBI as recently as last August that included various allegations connected to Epstein and multiple public figures. Some of that material referenced Trump. The DOJ has since said that certain allegations have already been deemed unfounded, but, crucially, they have offered very little detail about how that determination was reached. That's where things start to feel less like transparency and more like a shell game. If the DOJ is going to publicly declare allegations unfounded, you'd expect at least a basic explanation. Tell us what was investigated, what evidence was reviewed, what was corroborated, and what wasn't. And, who was interviewed, why they reached their conclusions. Instead, we've largely gotten just assertions and no documentation as to why they came to those conclusions. The gap between claim and explanation is exactly where suspicion thrives. This brings me to Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche. He had a recent interview with Dana Bash on CNN. If you watched it, you could almost admire, the discipline of it. Blanche didn't stumble. He didn't ramble. He didn't lose his temper. He just slid around every sharp question. Like he was on skates, sort of. When Bash pressed him about the Trump-related material, Blanche repeatedly urged viewers to think about all the names in the files, not just President Trump's. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. Nobody should focus exclusively on one person to the exclusion of others. As much as it annoys me to have to point out the painfully obvious, however, here it is. Trump is not just another name. He's the President of the United States. Of course his involvement deserves heightened scrutiny. Pretending otherwise is ridiculous. It's political theater. I want us to wonder why Bash didn't say this at the time. Blanche also avoided giving clear answers about how the allegations had been investigated, how rigorously they had been explored. There was no walkthrough of the process, no timeline, no report, no public-facing report anyway, no explanation of how the DOJ concluded that the many claims and allegations about numerous people were baseless. Instead, he pivoted, criticizing Bash for singling out Trump rather than addressing her core question. Nothing new there. And that deflection is exactly what makes people uneasy. At least people like me, I guess. If the investigation was thorough and airtight, why not proudly describe it? Why not put it all on the record and shut down speculation once and for all? The silence and the vagueness and the irritation are not the hallmarks of confidence. Much to the opposite, they are the telltale signs of someone who's doing damage control. And then there's Kash Patel. We have to go back in September for this little nugget, but back then, during a Senate hearing, Patel was asked directly whether Epstein had trafficked victims to anyone other than himself. Under oath, he stated that the FBI had no such information, and if they did, they would have thoroughly investigated it. But here's the problem. This testimony came less than a month after the FBI had compiled a list of allegations related to Epstein and various figures, the same compilation Dana Bash referenced in the recent interview with Blanche. So we're supposed to believe that in the span of just a few weeks between sometime in August and mid-September, the FBI not only reviewed all of those allegations, but rigorously investigated them, reached definitive conclusions, and determined that nothing credible pointed beyond Epstein himself. That strains credulity. That strains reality. Add to that the info that has now been released that really seems to indicate that persons other than Epstein were involved, and it really feels like what Patel said in September bordered on fantasy. Federal investigations are not fast. They usually take months, if not years. Even relatively straightforward cases involve interviews and document review, corroboration, and legal analysis, depositions. The idea that all of this was neatly wrapped up in a matter of a few weeks is a fairy tale. It's not diligent law enforcement, more like political triage. At minimum, the timeline raises serious questions about how seriously these allegations were treated. Now, let's zoom out a little bit. Even if you set aside the insistence by the FBI and the DOJ that nothing happened and no one did anything other than Epstein, Trump does not come to this conversation with a clean slate. Over the years, there has been a steady drumbeat of allegations and lawsuits and disturbing public statements that paint a troubling picture. There are the multiple women who have accused him of sexual misconduct. In civil court, a jury found him liable for sexually abusing E. Jean Carroll in the 90s, a ruling that did not come from social media or cable news, but from an American courtroom. There was the Stormy Daniels affair, followed by a scheme to conceal it, which resulted in a criminal conviction related to falsifying business records. Whatever your view of that case, it demonstrated a willingness to lie, cover up, and manipulate the truth to avoid embarrassment. And then, of course, we have Trump's own words. There's the famous Access Hollywood tape where he casually bragged about grabbing women without their consent, not as a joke, but as a boast. On Howard Stern's show, he openly discussed walking into the dressing rooms of teenage beauty pageant contestants, saying, in his own words, that because he owned the pageant, he could get away with it. He didn't say he was allowed, he said he could get away with it. That wasn't a stray comment. It was repeated in multiple interviews over time. None of this proves anything about Epstein, but taken together, it establishes a pattern. A man who has repeatedly shown poor judgment, lack of boundaries, and a casual attitude towards women's bodies and their autonomy. So when new murky information about Epstein's services, is it really rational to say, well, everyone else might be questionable, but Trump is definitely fine? At some point, disbelief requires more than blind loyalty. It requires logic. And logic is not on that side. There's an old saying that goes something like this. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. So this brings us to the heart of the matter. For years now, we've been asked to accept a very strange premise that in almost every other area of life, Trump lies constantly about elections, about crowd sizes, about hurricanes and windmills and faucets and wars that he's ended, about basic facts. But when it comes to his sexual history and his behavior, we are supposed to treat him as a model of honesty. Think about that. This is a man who lies about things that are objectively, provably false. He lies when it helps him. He lies when it hurts him. And sometimes for no clear reason at all. Yet somehow, we are supposed to believe that the one subject where he suddenly becomes transparent and trustworthy is in his own predatory conduct, or denial thereof. That doesn't even make sense. It doesn't pass the smell test. It's all faith and no evidence. And again, not to be repetitive, but I want to be crystal clear. The newly released portion of the files proves nothing. But all things considered, the release reinforces the need for skepticism, not deference. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the Republican Party as a whole, because their about-face on this issue is breathtaking. For years, many on the right screamed about secret sex trafficking cabals and Pizzagate conspiracies, and the idea that powerful Democrats were abusing children with impunity. They demanded the Epstein files. They vowed that once they were released, heads would roll. Now they have the power. Now they have the access. Now the files are out. And crickets. Where are all the congressional hearings? Where are the dramatic press conferences? Where are the deposition of persons named in the files? Where are the nightly tirades about justice for victims? Instead, the same voices that once treated Epstein like a national emergency have gone strangely quiet. Except, of course, when they're defending Trump. Meanwhile, those same politicians are happy to go on television every day railing about criminals crossing the border, insisting that we must root them out no matter what innocents get caught in the dragnet, no matter what constitutional rights are compromised. But when it comes to the real, documented victims of Epstein's abuse, suddenly their outrage has an expiration date. What are we supposed to make of that? Does that sound like principles in action? Or does it sound more like partisan flip-flopping? So where does that leave us? The latest Epstein release was billed as transparency. Really, it feels more like a carefully managed disclosure. Enough to claim openness, not enough to truly satisfy public curiosity. We still don't have clear answers about how allegations were investigated. We still don't have a detailed accounting of the DOJ's reasoning for saying all of this information amounts to nothing. And we still live in a country where political loyalty is outweighing concerns for victims. At some point, we have to stop giving anyone, even Donald Trump, the benefit of the doubt simply because of politics. Skepticism is not a conspiracy. It's common sense. Investigation is not judgment. It's justice. And if the GOP truly cared about protecting children and punishing predators the way they claim, they would be treating this moment as a moral imperative, not a political inconvenience. Sunlight may very well be the best disinfectant, but only if you actually let it in. This week's feel-good story, the high note, is short and sweet. And I gotta be honest right up front, I don't know if this story is real, but it has been posted on social media and attributed to one in particular user, and it's recently posted. It's not something that's been around for years, so I'm going to tell it to you. And if it's true, excellent. If it's fiction, at least it'll make you smile. So it was a late night when Tony, who runs a small pizza shop that mostly does deliveries, got a call that would change the way he thought about his work and about service. On the other end of the line was a woman from a local women's shelter. She was nervous, her voice low, almost hesitant. She said, "Do you have anything I can get for $6? I have 3 kids." Tony felt a pang. $6 wouldn't even cover one pizza, let alone feed a family of 4. But he didn't hang up. Instead, he did something on the spot that even he couldn't have predicted. He invented a family meal special. And here's the catch. It wasn't real. Not really. He told her it included 4 pizzas, breadsticks, drinks, cookies, and juice boxes, all for just $6. And he meant every word. When he delivered the order personally, he saw something that tightened his chest. The kids were hiding behind their mother, peeking around her, and she had bruises on her face. That night, Tony realized that sometimes a little imagination and a lot of heart can become something bigger than any menu item. That special didn't stop with one night. The woman who was staying at the shelter started calling every week, and Tony kept it going. Other drivers at the shop eventually joined in, bringing the same surprise meals to families in shelters, letting them feel seen and cared for in that moment. 3 months later, things began to change for that woman. She found a job. She got out of the shelter and she got her own apartment and she was back on her feet. And one day she walked into Tony's shop and handed him an envelope. Inside was $200. Tony tried to refuse, to tell her it wasn't necessary, but she shook her head and she said, "This is for all the specials. I know they weren't real, Please let me pay it forward. So Tony took that money and started a small pay it forward fund, using it to continue delivering meals to families in need. 6 years later, that fund has grown quietly but powerfully, helping deliver over 1,000 meals to families living in shelters and motels. All from a single phone call, $6, and a willingness to do more than what seemed necessary. A simple act of imagination became a ripple of kindness that still carries forward today. And that brings this week's episode to a close. I want to thank you all, as always, for taking the time to download and listen to this episode. I want to remind you that the podcast now has a website, www.neighborontheleft.com, where you can find links for contacting the podcast, blog posts that coincide with each episode, and also a web player page where you can listen to or download any episode of the podcast. We'll be back on Friday with another episode of Back Porch Files, the supplemental episodes. So until then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.